Thank you, Nancy. Well, welcome everybody. Everybody have a seat and get all comfy. So I was asked to talk about a little bit about design and analysis to creating new measures. And so I'm going to concentrate today at looking at talking about how do you go from start to finish, from just the idea that you want to measure all the way to establishing its reliability and validity. And I'm going to use a couple of examples within the context of gender-based violence. One, social norms around violence, sexual violence in Somalia and South Sudan. And the other one will be a housing instability measure that we've created for women who are survivors of domestic violence here in the United States. You're going to see that even though I'm a biostatistician and I love numbers and super quantitatively oriented, I believe strongly in mixed methods, that you can't develop a measure without being comfortable with the qualitative side of it too. But at the same time, you're going to have to choose a psychometric framework, so we're going to talk about two of the most popular frameworks today and what the differences are and when one might be more useful than the other. Little advice for writing good items. This may be things that you've already seen, but it's always good to remember them. And then to talk a bit about cross-validation as a process, which is needing to do it all over again, which a lot of people don't want to have to do. And when do you really need to do that, and when can maybe you move forward? Okay, so the first big question, and whenever I meet with anybody who wants to create a measure, is understanding what you're trying to measure. It's easy to say, I want to measure social norms, but I bet if I asked everybody in the room here, you'd have a different idea of what a social norm is. And so the place I usually start is asking, what are you after? You're trying to measure some underlying constructs, some attitudes, some beliefs. Are you trying to get a measure of stress? Are you trying to get a measure of work-life balance? Are you trying to get a measure of PTSD? Is there some underlying construct that you're trying to tap? That's sort of one class of measures. The other thing that you might be trying to do is to quantify the degree or the amount of something. And that might be aptitude. That might be a person's readiness to change, a patient's readiness to change. Or it may be a screening instrument where you're trying to really to say, where do people fall along this degree of possible things that could have happened to them? They're not so much an underlying construct, but you're trying to get at where they are on that degree. I think most of us think that we're trying to do an underlying construct because that's what measurement development is most commonly thought of. And sometimes you can get stuck if you stay there. So we're going to talk about that today. All right, so you got to figure out the content. What is it that you're going to measure? And there are all sorts of psychometric words for this. It's domains just mean what are the different aspects of it. Domain sampling is the idea that there may be lots of different components of what I'm trying to measure, and you want to be sure that you're measuring the different pieces of it and not the same one all over and over again. So the best place to start for that is interviews and focus groups with participants to better understand the construct and its associated domains. It's only you're going to be able to measure what that group of people perceives. So if we go in with our own ideas of this is what the construct is social norms, and social norms are believing that your father thinks that you shouldn't go out at night, or believing that your mother thinks you shouldn't report when you're a victim of rape. That's our idea of what those norms are. And so that's not a good place to start if we don't really know what the norms are. So it's better to start with the interviews, focus groups, capture the whole concept within the persons within that group, and most importantly, capture the words that they use to describe it. Because often, if we're trying to measure something new, part of the issue is language, and we have to be sure that we can match the language. So that's one really good place to start. Another possibility is to start with a theoretical model where the construct is already well defined. Somebody else has already done this work and laid out that model. Kind of, I would say, if you wanted to measure intelligence, somebody's already figured out quantitative intelligence and verbal intelligence and problem solving. So the model already exists. So you don't need to go in and do a bunch of focus groups or interviews to do that. So you can start from there. Or some observations. It may be that people can't talk about these things yet, and you may have to observe patterns of behavior in order to try to capture it. Okay, I'm going to talk about two of these frameworks. So the most common framework for testing measures is classical test theory. So how many of you are familiar with classical test theory? Okay. And so this is when you have an underlying construct or factor. You basically need to write several items to capture each factor. And each item you write is trying to measure the same thing on that factor. So you're trying to get multiple ways of getting at that same thing over and over again. Item response theory is a newer and now with the advent of ease of computing, it's becoming more popular way where what you believe is that there's a hierarchy of items that best represent what you're trying to measure. You're trying to measure that capture the degree of experiences. So for example, if we were creating a measure of patient activation, patient readiness to take control of their own mental health, we would expect them to go through different stages. And if you were willing to go to the doctor on a regular basis and you were willing to take your medication as prescribed, those two would probably go together. And then finally, if you're going to take control of your own mental health, then you have also probably learned about different ways of doing that. So you can order the items, and I'm going to go through an example that will show you that. The other less common theory is generalizability theory. And people who are concerned with generalizability theory are really concerned with the error of measurement. They want to know what are the sources of error in my data. And they realize that there could be many different sources. The source could be the items themselves. The source could be the people, because people could have different biases. The sources may be some overarching thing like organization. So if you're measuring organizational change, you would have organizational level error, you would have person level error, and item level error. And the idea of generalizability theory is that it's important to partition those pieces out so that you know where the error is coming from. And we're not going to talk about that so much today. Okay, reliability and validity. I think we've all heard those words. Whenever you think about a measure, creating a measure, you say that you need to establish its reliability and validity. So reliability just is the overall consistency of the measure. Does it produce similar results in consistent conditions? So the ultimate reliability is test-retest, where if I give you the same measure twice under the same conditions, I should get the same set of responses. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not possible. So what classical test theory did was extend that and say, what I should be getting is the same level of responses or the same pattern of responses across the different items. Because every item on my test or every item on my measure is actually measuring the same thing. So they are parallel measures of the underlying factor or construct. And so I can look in one administration within my items, and I should see this pattern that shows that they're parallel. Just like instead of test-retest, you're doing item-to-item tests, basically, item-to-item correlation, and you're saying all of these items are supposed to be measuring the same thing, so I should get the same pattern of responses. And that is why part of the reason why classical test theory is so popular, because you can get a reliability estimate out with a single administration. Now, IRT theory or item response theory would say, no, each item is not measuring the same thing. Each item is measuring a different degree of the same thing. And so if you answer yes to item 1, if that's on the lowest scale, that may or may not mean that you answered yes to item 5. But if you answered yes to item 5, then you probably answered yes to item 4, yes to item 3, yes to item 2, and yes to item 1. So they're not the items are not parallel anymore, but they represent differential degrees of the thing that you're trying to measure. All right, so validity is the degree to which there's evidence and theories support the interpretation of your test scores as what you propose that they're supposed to measure. It's really asking the question, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? And so your choice of psychometric framework only influences reliability, but not validity. So how you approach the testing of validity is going to be the same, whether you're designing your instrument with a classical test theory approach or with an item response theory approach. What's going to differ is how you establish reliability. Okay? Any questions, or you guys all with me so far? Okay, great. All right, little math, gotta have a little math. Can't have fun without a little math. So reliability is really a pretty simple concept. You have some observed score. That's the measure that you got out. So you went, you asked your person a question on a scale of 1 to 5. Do you agree or disagree? They gave you 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. You added up 10 items, took the average, and you have a mean score. So that's what we call your observed score. But classical test theory and even item response theory says that that score represents some sort of true score that we can't see, we can't measure, because if we could, we wouldn't need to be developing a measure, some sort of underlying true score plus some error. And then generalizability theory is the one that comes in and says, well, now let's break that error, that E term, down into its multiple components. Classical test theory and item response theory lump all the kinds of errors together. And so reliability is just what is the proportion of your observed score that is caused by the true score, the true underlying score. In other words, what's the good variance in there? How much of the variability in my observed score is caused by my true amount, if I'm measuring stress, my true amount of stress, even though I don't really know what that is. How much of it is caused by some error of measurement, misunderstanding the questions not being relevant to me, all of those other things. And then some people like to talk about unreliability, which is just the flip side of reliability. It's how much of your variability in your scores is due to error rather than due to the true underlying score. Okay, so validity, I already said, is established if a measure has validity, if it measures what it purports to measure. So you need to ask yourself, does it have the expected patterns of relationships with other variables? If I'm measuring stress, is it related to maybe some physiological measure of stress? Or is it related to illness or days missed from work? And also you want to ask yourself, are there known groups that it should be able to distinguish between? It's probably the case that social norms towards sexual violence would be different for men and women. And I might want to look at that and see if, in fact, is that true. And then, most of the times, we're designing a measure in order to use it as an outcome measure. I would say most of us, that's what we're trying to do. And so we want to know that that measure is sensitive to change. So, because that's how we're going to use it. If you intervene in some way, or if somebody has some new experiences, will you see that difference in change? The problem with trying to establish sensitivity to change is that it requires repeated measures. And most people don't develop measures by doing a longitudinal study. They do it with just a single time point. So that's a bigger question, but it could be an important one. All right. Which is more important, reliability or validity? What do you guys think? Reliability? Do you say reliability? Anybody else? Validity? All right, so there is no that answer is sort of up to you. But I can have a perfect reliable measure that's not measuring what I think it is. That if I go out and do test, retest, I get the same response on it. I get the same means of variances and everything. Great correlation, but it's not measuring what I think I'm measuring. And so it has no validity, but it's highly reliable. So then I ask myself, well, can a scale be valid if it isn't reliable? Well, if I have a scale that is not reliable, then it's going to have a lot of error in it. And when I look at and that should influence its ability to correlate with other things. So I should see low reliability should also lead to lower validity, so that they are kind of connected. So I think everybody gets to have their own answer to this question. My general answer is I weigh a little bit more on validity than I do on reliability, but I want to know that reliability is okay. And when I'm thinking about writing my items, I'm writing them to be sure I have the most valid measure I possibly can come up with. Then after that, I think about, okay, how do I have any sources of error? Do I have bad wording, things in here that's going to influence its reliability? So I think it's validity I attack first in the process of writing items, and reliability second. All right, so how do we create a measure? We got to operationalize what we want to measure. We got to decide on a framework. Then we got to write items. And then you got to get feedback on those items, and you're probably going to need to revise those items. That's a long and sometimes frustrating process, but it's a really important process. Then you need to specify your validity hypotheses. So if I'm measuring social norms around sexual violence, what else should that be correlated with? That might be correlated with people's beliefs about males' dominance. There may be other things that it should be correlated with. If I'm trying to measure housing instability, what should that be correlated with? That should probably be correlated with poorer health. That should probably be correlated with lack of income. So you want to specify those hypotheses a priori before you test your instrument to know what should this be related to. Then you want to collect data from lots of people, and in the end we'll talk about what is a lot, but more is always better. And then you're going to analyze it based on your psychometric framework that you've chosen and examine the reliability and validity. And then you're going to revise the measure and retest if necessary. So it's a long process, and it's really important to allow yourself that amount of time to go through all these steps. I typically would say don't try to do it in under a year. We have done it in under a year when pressured, but it's pretty hard. Okay, so the examples I'm going to use today are the social norms for sexual violence, and that's going to be my classical test theory example. It's also one that we really needed input from the communities that we were working in to define the construct. So we had to start with some qualitative work. And I think all the items on that measure should be measuring that same underlying construct of social norms. And then the housing instability for survivors of DV is going to be our item response theory example, because elements are and here the elements of the constructs were already pretty well known. We already know what living in your car or sleeping in a motel or staying at a friend's house or being evicted from your apartment. We kind of already knew what housing instability was, but we didn't know how they progressed. And so we thought there should be a progression of events that's associated with it, and so we thought that was a better underlying model. So the social norms measure we were charged with developing a measure of social norms for sexual violence against women and girls. It's going to be used as an outcome measure for testing the effectiveness of a social norms intervention in the communities of Somalia and South Sudan. In Somalia, it's targeting women and everybody, communities in the IDP camps, and also the host communities associated with those camps. In South Sudan, we're working in two very, very different villages, Ye and Warp, that have different views of women, and so they're all for me. They're even though they're within the same country, they're two different sites, and I wouldn't just combine them because they come from the same country. So this work is funded by UNICEF, and Nancy is the PI on the project. So we started, in order to operationalize the measure, we started with focus group discussions. And it took a long time even just to write our focus group guide here. Just knowing what questions to ask was a big challenge. And so we created that guide by working with the implementing partners in the countries that we were working with, the other NGOs in those countries, as well as Somalians and South Sudanese who could talk about these. And so we spent a lot of time with them just to really, among us, around a table talking about what is a social norm, what is gender-based violence, what isn't gender-based violence. They needed to talk through that themselves because the men and the women in the room had very different views of whether it was acceptable or not. And so we had to work through all of that as the process of even getting out what it was. In general, we were trying to look for harmful norms, things that cause people to hide, sexual violence. We were really interested in what led to people to report or not to report. And then because we're studying social norms, we needed to know who influences your social norm, because your social norm is what you think other people think you should do. So who are the people you care about the most? Who are the influences on that? And we needed to get that. And in addition, in this study, the intervention is aimed at many sectors: the community, healthcare providers, justice system, and so we needed to get a kind of a view of what was going on there. So once we got our focus group guide written, we then conducted focus groups, and I think this slide is what's important here is that we wanted very diverse input. And so we set up a sampling frame for our focus groups to look at both men and women, to look at age categories because we knew it was going to differ by age category, and then the role in the community of the participants because we were just thinking that these are going to make a difference. So religious leaders, service providers, teachers, unmarried people and married people might have different, and then traditional elders of the community as well as youth in the community. So we stratified our transcripts, our focus groups, and did a total of 42 focus groups across the 2 countries. And then we had to analyze it. So we did a qualitative descriptive analysis where we were trying to find common themes related to social norms. And so we read, Nancy, myself, and our research associate read the transcripts and coded them, first identifying major themes and then identifying sub-themes. We would meet regularly to discuss differences and calibrate, but there was a lot of transcripts to read and very, very interesting. In the end, we began to identify sub-themes. For example, gender equality came out a lot, or protecting the family honor and not wanting and trying to worry about shame and stigma. So we began to get these sub-themes that were coming out and across the groups. And so once we had our sub-themes identified, we made sure that we had example quotes because it was really important for us to use the words of the participants when we were writing items. And that turned out to be a challenge because depending on what community you're in, even depending on what community you are in within a given state, those words could change. And so we really wanted to stick with those, the wordings of those quotes. And then we began to write the items, and I'll give you some examples. So sexual violence is a social norm. People accept sexual violence against women and girls as a normal part of life. So that's one of the things that we would hear from them, that it's just a normal part of life. It's part of living here. Husbands' rights and roles. It's okay for a man to physically punish his wife if she does not obey him. That was another norm. Rape should not be reported to protect the dignity of the family, as an example item for protecting family dignity. And then gender roles. Women should have a lower status than men in the community. It's important to send to boys' school, more important to send boys' school than a girls' school, those sorts of things. So once we got all of our items written, we then had them reviewed by the in-country teams, and I'm going to go all the way to there. We had them, we discussed the items with the in-country teams and with the folks at UNICEF headquarters. We asked people to change, if they thought the intervention could change this, if it was relevant to their community, if they thought it should be included, and suggestions for rewarding. And then based on that, we were able to narrow down the items. We took suggestions for rewarding from the in-country teams over the folks from from the external environment because they often disagreed, and so if there was a doubt, if there was a difference, the in-country teams were the ones that were important. So before I show you the results, I just want to talk a little bit about writing good items. There are a few things if you keep in mind when you write an item, it really helps a lot. Make sure the item's not double-barreled. I frequently have trouble remembering information and solving problems. What's wrong with that item?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's asking two things. Some people might have trouble remembering information, but not trouble solving problems, or vice versa. So it's really asking about two different concepts. And I would want to create two items out of that one, if that's what I was trying to measure. Make sure your item is specific. I frequently have trouble remembering things. Yes, Nancy's going to say, but that may not be specific enough. It may be, I have no trouble remembering birth dates and other things, but I have trouble remembering why I went to the grocery store and what I need to buy. So you have to be more specific than the word things to narrow it down. Make sure the item's not biased. It's difficult for me to fill out the complicated paperwork required by insurance companies. What's wrong with that one? Complicated, right? It's biasing the item, so I would have to take out the word complicated and just say it's difficult for me to fill out paperwork required by insurance companies. Or I guess I could say it's difficult for me to get on the website and enroll in health insurance now. I could update that item. And then you have to make sure the item has consistent meaning for all respondents, and so that has a lot to do with your wording. You've got to be careful of that. So you want to make sure that the respondent is capable of answering the questions, that they understand the question, that they know the answer. I mean, there are times that people may not be able to answer because they'll say, I don't know, I have no idea. You want to be sure that they can recall the answer accurately. So asking questions about the long ago past is probably not going to be helpful if you're asking about daily things that change often. So my favorite example question I saw once was, how frequently do you forget to take your medication? So I don't think people could answer that question, because what if I forgot that I took the medication, right? I wouldn't be able to tell you how frequently I forget to take the medication if I'm forgetting to take the medication. So probably not the best way at getting at that idea. You want to make sure the wording is appropriate for the reading level if it's going to be read. Even if it's going to be spoken, if you're going to ask the questions verbally, the reading levels can help in just the understanding of language. So you don't have to don't get caught up on the word reading. And make sure the wording is appropriate for the cultural context. You may have to change it for different contexts. And time frames, if relevant. A lot of times people don't put a time frame, or they change time frames, and so you have to really ask yourself, what do I want to know? Do I want to know about your experiences in the last month, your experiences in the last year, in the last week? And that can be really important. The other key to writing good items is creating good response scales. And this is something that it's important to think carefully about and think about what's appropriate for your construct. So the strongly agree to strongly disagree may not always be the best choice, and it's one that we often go to, or rarely, never, rarely, seldom, all the time. They may not be the best choice. So this was really a challenge for us in thinking about social norms, because you kind of wanted to write the questions to be strongly disagree, to disagree. Men in our community are treated as more important than women. You could see how you could agree or disagree with that statement, but that's not measuring social norms. Because social norms is about how many people in your community think that. Maybe some do, maybe some don't. So we really wanted the measure to reflect how many of the folks in your community are holding these norms. So we created a measure, a response scale that was none to all of them. It was difficult to explain. So one of the things we realized with this study is that we had to do lengthy introductions and examples so that we were sure people knew how to use the response scale. So here's an example from the instrument. I'll be reading you statements about what you think about the people whose opinions matter most to you when responding to the statement. I would like to know how many of the people who are important to you think others should do things. That alone was totally confusing to everybody, okay? And it's confusing to me too. So, but when we were working with the in-country teams, what we said is, okay, let's do this by example. So for example, how many people, of the people who are important to you, expect women but not men to wash dishes? Do none of these people expect women but not men to wash dishes? Do a few of them think that? About half of them? Do most of them? Do all of them? And then through the use of those examples, we were able to get people to understand what we were after. Okay, as I mentioned, we used classical test theory for this framework, for this model, or this measure. So that's a latent variable model, or the scores are caused by some underlying construct. Once again, the observed score is a function of the true score plus the error. So it's basically saying that I have a construct of social norms, sexual violence as a social norm. And because I have in my head some view of that, that causes how I would respond to different questions. So that internal construct for me causes how we respond to people accept sexual violence as against women and girls as a normal part of life. So that's the underlying theoretical model of classical test theory. And this is a model that we thought fit well with what we were trying to do. In actuality, in our measure, we have 4 different constructs that make up social norms. Sexual violence as a norm, family honor and stigma, gender equality, and husband's rights. So each of those have a different set of items that we wrote for them. Okay, does that make sense? So our analysis goals was to show that the items grouped together for the constructs, for the 4 different constructs, we needed to estimate reliability in some way. We wanted to show that the measure is related to other things in the way we expect it to be related to. And then, of course, we needed to collect data, and we went with 200 people in each site. So 200 people in Mogadishu, 200 in Yei, and 200 in Warp. So a lot of people. So our analysis approach was factor analysis. How many of you are familiar with the ideas behind factor analysis? Okay, great. So I'm not going to give you a factor analysis course, but in general, factor analysis is trying to demonstrate that the items, in this case, align with the constructs or the factors in the way that we thought they should, and that the factors are, in fact, distinct from one another. They're measuring different things. You can use either a confirmatory or an exploratory approach, and I'm just going to show you an exploratory one real quick. And I know this is small, but this is the pattern that you would hope to see on a factor analysis. I have 4 factors, and you can see that the first 5 items load on what we would say load on the first factor, because they all have fairly high scores on that factor. Expect the family to ignore or reject a daughter if she's been raped. Expect the husband to abandon his wife if she reports rape. Accept sexual violence as a normal part of life. Blame women and girls, and think that the man has the right to demand sex. Okay, so those items all grouped together, which of my constructs do you think that is? Yes, social violence as a norm, right. And then the next one, expect girls not to report rape to protect family dignity. A girl's reputation will be damaged if she reports to authorities or elders. Sexual violence should be handled as a family matter. Fear of stigma. Husbands to retaliate against the perpetrators, and expect women only to report if there's been severe physical injuries. Which one do you think that one is? Family honor, right. Yep, that's my family honor one. And then expect women to participate equally with their husbands in the household, sending daughters to school, and men to treat women and girls as if they're important. That would be gender roles, right? And then the last one, expect a husband to force his wife to have sex if she doesn't want to. Think the man has a right to punish his wife. If a man beats his wife, he's showing his love for her. It's okay for a man to beat his wife, to discipline her, and then forced sex. So that one's going to be husband's rights. Now notice I have one item down here. Think that if an unmarried woman or girl is raped by a man, she should marry him rather than not being married at all. That didn't load on anything. It was a theme that came up over and over again when we were talking as something that's really important. But you can see, one, that that's it's a very long item. It's complex. There may be too many things going in on there. And so I think at this point in time we have to decide whether we're going to drop it or whether we're going to try to rewrite it. But it was not our best item. So for the further analyses, I just dropped it. Okay, so this just runs through the exact items that went on each one that we just read. So the next thing I needed to do was estimate reliability for this measure. So I went with internal consistency because I thought all the items should correlate in the same way with the total score, and I think that that they should basically be parallel items, all measuring the same thing. And so I used Cronbach's alpha, which is a measure of internal consistency. And I found a consistency of 0.75, 0.73, 0.58, 0.69. Now, in general, the rule of thumb is Cronbach's alpha is greater than 0.7 or good. Cronbach alpha of 0.99 would basically mean that you're asking the same question over and over and over again, and then you could just reduce to a single item in that case. So that's not what I'm striving for. I'm usually striving for something right around the 0.7 because I want to be sure that I'm getting a cross section of items. So you can see that I'm doing okay by gender equality, which had 3 items, and husband rights that had 4 items or a little bit less. So we'll ask ourselves, the next question is, well, what affects alpha? One of the things that affects alpha is the number of items. So the more items you have, the higher your alpha level in general. Also, the total variance. If you've got a scale with very little variability in it, it's going to be hard to get reliability out of it. And then the distribution. If you have severely skewed distribution, that's going to affect your reliability because the reliability measure is based on a normal distribution. So I asked myself, well, what's wrong? Clearly, my gender equality and husband rights has fewer items in it, but I also want to make sure that it doesn't have to do with their distribution too. So here you see the distributions of the 4 subscales. They're not bad at all, really. Actually, they're pretty darn good. I wasn't that, I have no really long tails. I wasn't too concerned about the distribution. The variance, which is how fat or skinny that normal curve is on top of it, the variance is pretty consistent across the 4. So I really think it's the number of items. So now our task is to write more items for gender equality and more items for husband's rights before we do the next round. So, which we'll be doing next week, writing items. Okay, so then I need to look at its validity. So I made some hypotheses based on the construct, so group differences, and then changes over time or changes due to the intervention. And in this case, I know that there are differences across the sites and the social norms. I mean, we picked those sites in part because of that. And so I should be able to see that there are differences. And so this is just for sexual violence as a social norm, just one of the subscales. And you can see I just did an analysis of variance to test if the groups were significantly different from each other, and all 3 of them are significantly different from each other. And more importantly, it's the pattern I expected. We know that social norms towards sexual violence are much more accepted in EA than in the other communities, and that War and Bandera, Somali were actually quite similar in their social norms. Then I went on to look at gender differences. I would expect to have gender differences. So women perceive sexual violence as a social norm significantly more than men do. They also think that protecting the family honor is more of a pressure for them than the men do. Where men think that gender equality is a social norm more so than women, and not surprising when you think about it. And then husbands' rights, women see that as being more of a social norm than the men do. So that was a pattern we expected to see. And then this last one is we asked people when they were, as we move into that scale, who are the important others to you? When you're thinking about these things, who are the important others? And of the subset of people who name their mother versus their father as their first most important other, I looked at the differences there. So if your father was your most important other, then you perceived sexual violence to be a greater social norm than if your mother was. And if you, same with a greater social norm around protecting family honor and gender equality and husband's rights. So definitely saw it as a stronger norm when your father was the person who was influencing you versus your mom. Okay, so the take home from this measure is that the qualitative work was extremely important. We needed to understand the context, and we needed to get the person's words out. Classical test theory was a nice fit for this one. I had multiple dimensions of social norms, and I had multiple items for those. And validity, I went with the approach of saying there are some differences that should be seen here based on what I know about the communities that we're working in. All right, so measuring housing instability. This is a measure that came out of a study called SHARE, which was looking at the impact of different housing interventions on survivors of domestic violence. Nancy Glass and Chiquita Rollins at the county in Portland mental health were the PIs on it. So this is not, in this case, the outcome measures were mental health and safety of the woman, but we were measuring housing interventions and the impact of housing interventions. So it was also important to me to get some idea of how unstable their housing was. And in the literature, housing instability was really simply defined as, can you pay your rent or mortgage? Does more than 50% of your household income go to paying housing? Are you living in overcrowded conditions, doubling up with friends? And in general, it was just a yes, no, you live in an unstable housing situation or you live in a stable housing situation. And we were really interested in measuring the degree to which women were in an unstable housing situation. And we had indicators, and we knew we could count those, and we thought those indicators should have some sort of hierarchy. So you guessed it. We went with item response theory for this one because the items should be tapping different degrees of the level of housing instability. And we wanted to find that hierarchy, and we wanted to be sure that we could discriminate across the full range of housing instability. So the items that went into our measure were these: being unlikely to pay for housing, being not expecting to stay in your current housing, and then questions around the last 6 months: receiving financial assistance, having 3 or more moves, living somewhere they didn't want to, difficulty paying, borrowing money, trouble with the landlord, being threatened to be evicted, getting evicted, and getting housing. So in item response theory, what you're interested in is it's what we call item characteristic curves. And this is the relationship between endorsing an item, experiencing one of these items, and the total score. So the ability of an item, it's really what we're concerned with is how well can an item differentiate between the different levels of housing instability. So if you look at the center graph here, no matter how bad your housing instability is, which is represented on the x-axis, the same proportion of people are going to respond yes to that. So that question doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't differentiate between people with high housing instability and people with low housing instability. If you look at the one on the right, you can see that there is a point of housing stability that item is really good at differentiating. It's really good at differentiating sort of the lower half and the upper half. And the one on the left is one that does an okay job at differentiating across the entire scale. So this is what I want to look at as part of establishing reliability of my measure. I want to look at these item characteristic curves. So for me, I did this. This is longitudinal data, and so I looked at it both at baseline and 6 months just to be sure that I was seeing the same pattern in my curves. So did you live somewhere that you didn't want to live? That's a pretty nice one. It's doing okay. Moved 3 or more times? That's okay too. It's a different pattern, but it is differentiating. Receive financial assistance for housing. not good. And then when I went and thought more about that, it made sense because of a lot of, if you got financial assistance, it may be because you have very unstable housing, or it may be making you have stable housing. And a lot of the interventions we were looking at was financially assisted housing, which to stabilize your housing. So that's not going to be a good item. And here's another one, needing to borrow money. So just so that we know it's not just finances here, it does have a better pattern. This is quite a busy slide, but this is all items on one slide. And what's important here is that the item, if I have a good scale, I want my items to be able to differentiate across the entire range of my scale. So I don't want these curves to be on top of each other. I want them to be staggered across here. And so, for example, you can see that this orange one does a really good job at differentiating between no housing instability and very low housing instability. This orange curve does. But then beyond that, it doesn't do much. This blue one here does a really good job at differentiating between mid-range and a little bit higher. And so this is the pattern that I want to see. I don't want them all squished together. I want them spread off around the whole area here. So my scale is doing a better job at differentiating between 0 and 8 than it is between 8 and 10. And then this item you can see is not doing anything at all. So those items allow me to come up with a hierarchy. The one that's furthest on the left is going to be the bottom level of my hierarchy, and the one that's furthest on the right is going to be the top level of my hierarchy. And for this data, this is how the hierarchy that came out. Not having to live somewhere you don't want to, having difficulty paying for housing, trouble getting housing, needing to borrow money, not expecting not to be able to stay, having trouble with your landlord, moving 3 times in the last 6 months, threatened to be evicted and served an eviction notice, and then not likely to pay for housing, be able to pay for housing in the next month. Okay, I love this slide, but I'm sure all of you hate this slide. So this is item response theory is about patterns, and this is a pattern. So what's below the diagonal? So if I take a column, question 1, column 1, 37, 61, 57, 60. Those are the percent of people who answered no. So if I answered no to question 1, then what percent of people answered no to all the questions above it, which is the pattern I would expect. And you can see as I get further and further up on the hierarchy, I'm getting more and more into the 90s. Then for question 2, that 85 is what percent of the people who answered yes to question 2 also answered yes to question 1, which is what I would expect on the hierarchy. And then starting at 47, it would be what percent of the people who answered no to question 2 also answered no to all the ones above it. Okay, so the lower upper right is the yeses and the lower are the no's. And you can see as you look through this that I have the pattern pretty much that I want. Of course, the items don't do a great job of differentiating from the ones right next to it, and that you can see because of my curves kind of being bunched up in some places. But in general, they're doing a pretty good job, and I really do like these items. And so I often create this table just to get a feel for how well they're doing. And then in item response theory, you often look at the item discrimination and the item difficulty. And so these are my items ranked in their hierarchy. The numbers here, high group, are the number of yes responses in the high group to item 1. So the high group is the top third of my participants that scored the top third of the scale. The low group are the participants that scored at the bottom third of the scale. So of the people who scored at the bottom third of the scale, I think it's almost 100 in each group, if I remember. It's half of them for item 1 in the low, but almost all of them in item 2. So then item difficulty then is that difference between the proportion of people who scored high and low. Item discrimination is that difference. And if item discrimination is equal to 1, then then it perfectly discriminates between those two groups. You have an item that is perfect for those two groups. You wouldn't normally see it at 1. 0.5 or above is looking pretty good. And you can see my item 10 down here is not my best item in the world. But the other ones are pretty good. And then item difficulty should reflect my hierarchy, because item difficulty is just in general which items are people more likely to endorse. So at the bottom of my hierarchy, 76% of my participants endorse the first item. And you can see it flows right with my hierarchy up to only 22% endorsing my last item. So that supports my hierarchy. Okay, so I have to establish validity yet for this. So here are things that we went into thinking that it should be related to. This was an extensive instrument, and so we had a lot of other measures to look at it with. We thought increased housing instability would be related to decreased access to health care, increased acute care utilization, poor physical and mental health, more insecurity for food, higher rate of IPV, having a criminal record, not being employed, lower education, and drug and alcohol use. I'm not going to show you all of those things, but they were all things we hypothesized it should be related to. And in general, that's what we found it with everything but general health. That was the only one that wasn't significant, but the higher housing instability, the higher your hospital emergency medical use, the higher your PTSD, the higher your depression, the higher your, oops, I got that one on there twice. And then the less likely you are to have private health insurance. Then we looked at housing instability by their current living situation. And so we hypothesized that if you were living in a house or an apartment where you're able to pay your own rent, you would have the lowest level of housing instability. If you were sharing an apartment, it might be a little bit higher. If you're in a shelter or a motel, it might be higher yet. And so we found significant differences among all of these different living situations for the women at baseline, which also supports the validity of our measure. Okay, so in this, the overview for this measure is that the components of housing instability were already known, so we didn't have to do a lot of qualitative work. We used item response theory to explore the hierarchy of the items, because that's what was really important to us. That's what we wanted to come out with. And our validity was supported by the expected pattern of relationships with other variables. So one question that we often get is, do I have to cross-validate? If the initial testing of your measure leads to substantial changes, the new and improved version should be tested on a different sample. And so by substantial, that's because those changes are often data-driven, which means that they were driven by the characteristics of that specific sample that you had. And you got to make sure that you need to ask, is it a function of that data or is it a function of something else? So if I ended up having to write a whole bunch of new items, I had to drop items, then I would go out and do it again. If the changes were minor, I dropped a few questions, I needed to tweak the wording a little bit, then I'd usually say, okay, it's not worth the time and financial investment to cross-validate a scale. So for the social norms scale, I'm thinking we're good to go. We need to write a couple more items. We only dropped 2 items out of everything we started from. And we're going to write a couple more items just to strengthen those reliabilities, but there wasn't anything wrong with the other items. In the housing index, I do feel like we need to look at that in another sample, which we have, but I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. Because the hierarchy was determined, in this case, that hierarchy was determined by that sample. We didn't know what it was going in. We used the data to figure out what it was. And so I want to confirm that I see it in a different sample. And also we had a very high poverty level sample, and I think it's important to look at that across a broader spectrum. So that data is awaiting me. So data collection. So this is probably the most common question I get asked: how big of a sample do I need? In classical test theory, the general rule of thumb is 10 subjects per the item of your largest scale. So if I have a scale with 10 items on it, then I need 100 subjects. If I have a scale with 40 items on it, then I need 40 subjects. The problem with that rule of thumb is that there is a minimum. So if you have a 4-item scale and only 40 subjects, it's probably not enough in order to get a stable estimate of your correlations. So I generally say my personal rule is 200. If I'm measurement development, my minimum is 200. But people definitely do it with smaller groups. In item response theory, there's a lot of debate about this. And in the early uses of item response theory, they were recommending sample sizes in the thousands. And that's why it didn't get used a whole lot, honestly. I mean, like 1,000 to 5,000. But there's been a lot of recent research and a lot of simulation studies recently that shows that that's probably a very big overestimate of what you need. And some people are saying 500, some people are saying 200. And so it's, there's still some debate on that.
When you're doing multiple sites like you did with the social run, do you say, let's say you're using 200, are you going to 200 per site, or is it more?
Well, it depends on what you think. If you think your sites are different from one another, then I'm going to do 200 per site. Especially if I'm doing sites that are culturally different, because I want to be sure I want to be able to show that measure is good in each of the sites. Yeah. So, but if your sites are pretty much comparable, then it could be 200 across sites. You got to think ahead of time about the variables that you're going to include for establishing validity. So, and you want those to be good variables. You want them to be known scales that already have good psychometric properties. You can't be testing your validity test variable. You can't be developing it at the same time you're developing your new measure. So, pick among things that are already pretty well established. And remember, you don't have to have something that's measuring the same thing. People always get hung up on that. If there's already a scale out there that was measuring what you're measuring, you don't need to create a measure. You just need to have a very strong theoretical reason for it being correlated with something. And you're not going to find a correlation of 0.9. You're not going to find a perfect correlation. But you should find a sizable correlation. And in general, if you do have to go back in and do that cross-validation sample, it can be a smaller sample because you're starting from a confirmatory approach. You're saying, I already know exactly what this should look like, and I'm only testing that hypothesis, that this scale should behave in exactly the same way as it did before. And so you're really only testing one thing and not a whole bunch of different things. And so you can go with a smaller sample size. And I think that is it. Right one. Pardon?
Will you go through the same exact statistical process to create a screening tool?
Yes, I would. I would actually, with screening tools, I tend towards the IRT type measures better because it's you're looking at a continuum of things rather than a single underlying construct. So in a screener, you still want to show that you have those items, and then the big question is going to become, what is the critical score that you're going to put your cutoff at? So I find, like housing instability. Maybe I want to take my housing instability index and turn it into a yes/no. This person, it is an unstable place. Then I'm going to have to find a way to find out what that right cutoff score on that is. But I would use this process to do the first part of it, and then you can move into sensitivity and specificity if that's what the right thing is, or other approaches. Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh-huh. You're right.
Sexual and gender violence.
That's the first one. Yeah, we do not have economic questions as part of this, forming the social norm around it. So remember, we're tapping the social norm rather than gender, the existence of whether gender equality exists, but just the norms around it. So we don't have any financial questions in there.
So that's probably kind of, answers my second question, which is that if the research is doing one, and the effectiveness of the intervention, at some point during the focus group for older people, for example, positive teammates, we asked what they felt also.
We did ask that as part of our focus groups and use that information for the folks. We are not designing the intervention. We are just assessing the intervention. So we did feed that information back to UNICEF, who's creating the actual intervention materials.
Just one question about the sexual violence framework. It was mostly about, you said that you try and have the items reflect the language or the voice that from place to place, if people talk about a certain kind of contract differently or a certain subscale differently, how do you change the way you phrase the item?
That's a good-
How do you figure out?
That's a
how
good
to-
question. That's a really good question. In this case, we looked for questions where there are agreements across sites on how it was conceptualized, and I totally didn't even talk about translation, which was a whole another huge aspect of it. But that was another piece. So sometimes the translation might switch a word around a bit, but we got agreement on what the underlying construct was. But you could conceive of designing a measure in which there were different items for different contexts depending upon what's relevant. And that's fine. The problem is that you cannot compare across contexts then. Yeah. But it might be more important to be sure you're capturing the right thing in that context than to compare across contexts.
If you find yourself in a position where you have a scale but it wasn't developed in the way that you're describing with the sexual violence one where you had some formative or you had some qualitative information, is there anything to be gained by still doing focus groups after using the scale and then afterwards having focus groups to try to understand the half, what the half analysis at the end, for example, so that you can maybe name those.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. So, and often if you're starting from somebody else's scale, that can be a starting point for a focus group. Just discussion of those items and what do the people see them as measuring. Yeah. We are going to we'll take all the analysis results back to the in-country team and confirm the interpretation. These are just now working on these, so they're not quite done yet. So. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
Regarding the item response to it,
Mm-hmm.
I guess you explain two things. One is, why was the degree important for that particular question, and then why is the item response to it? And then the second one was, how was the reliability measure in that, around 3%? Is that any different from how reliability is measured in the
Okay, so yeah. So we selected item response theory because we thought that there were different levels of housing instability. That housing instability wasn't just a common construct where I could ask you 10 questions, and if you said yes to one, you should also say yes to the next one. You should also say next one. That it really was a gradation, and I wanted to capture that gradation. And I wanted to find a hierarchy of items that basically, I wanted to show, and part of item response theory is I want to establish reliability by showing that if you have been evicted from your house, you also have had trouble with your landlord in the past. You've also probably had to borrow money in the past. You've also probably moved a lot. I wanted to show that hierarchy, and that's part of establishing the reliability. We're also used to saying, well, what's reliability? What's your Cronbach's alpha? And that's your reliability. That's a number that you put on it. And so item response theory does allow you to get a pseudo reliability measure out of it. So if you need that number, you can use that number. But really, the reliability is in the pattern of the responses. You also can do. There's nothing wrong with doing Cronbach's alpha, and I think if I remember correctly, I think I did it. There's nothing wrong with doing Cronbach's alpha. Yeah, I did do it. But the thing about Cronbach's alpha is if it's bad, it doesn't mean you're not reliable. So it's if you want to, you can always look at it. But so. Mm-hmm.
The other question that many do
Yes.
so the question is that the validity and how you apply.
I think that's a good question. So, if the gold standard was out there, you might not even need to be developing your measure. And so a lot of times when we're developing a measure, there is not a gold standard out there. And that is the role that the validity piece takes. So the validity piece is saying, okay, if this thing is working the way it's supposed to be working, if it's measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, then it better be related to these other constructs. And so you're less concerned with sensitivity and specificity in terms of are you picking up certain people and missing other kinds of people than you are in creating a measure that says, hey, it's doing what I want to do. So I think that, like in a screener example, you automatically go to wanting to say this screener can do the trick. But if there's no gold standard out there, you don't have that option. Instead, you're just going to have to say this screener is doing a good job because it predicts, the people it predicts to screen positive are also the people who have the lowest income, who, it behaves the way it's supposed to be behaving.
And so
Mm-hmm. The social norms one? Oh, right, uh-huh. Okay, so here we knew about, the sites were selected because we knew that they were very different. We knew Yale was going to have more traditional views of sexual violence, more accepting views of sexual violence, and that Warp would be the lowest. So that's what we were looking at. That measure should be able to pick that up. So that was a known difference based on study design, and then based on just theoretical and understanding of differences, we expected women to perceive the social norms as being stronger than men. All right. Well, great. Thank you, everybody.